The slap hit first, and the street went silent like somebody unplugged the whole block, and for a second all I could hear was my own breath catching on the taste of copper, my cheek burning under a big man's hand, the way asphalt burns your palm when you fall off a bike as a kid. Sergeant Rick Doyle smiled like he'd just taught someone a lesson and said my badge was a toy, that my ID was a joke, that I should quit pretending I belong on the steps of Liberty Hall Courthouse. And I looked him in the eye and said, "Calm as a midnight road, you just ended a career," and I let him guess whose. He loved the cuffs, you could tell by the way he clicked them like a salesman demonstrating features, turning me toward the cameras as if humiliation was part of the show. His partners Kelly and Ruiz nudging each other while their little blue wall group chat lit up with laugh-cry emojis and tough guy one-liners. And I kept thinking about the line my mother used to say when somebody in church got too loud about righteousness. The louder the choir, the more they're hiding. You know what I mean? We hit the metal detectors. Security froze. A guard's face went pale like he'd seen a ghost in a suit, and he whispered to the bailiff, "Marco Alvarez, the way people whisper around hospital beds. That's Judge Darius Cole." And Marco stepped forward without fuss, told Doyle to release the cuffs, and Doyle puffed up, asked who he thought he was, and Marco pointed to the thin white scar on my wrist and said softly, "Fallujah, 2006. He kept a kid breathing with one hand and dragged two Marines out with the other, and the lobby went quiet, in that heavy way that isn't peace, it's realization. And I lifted my cuffed hands like a man choosing which door leads to oxygen, and said, "Sergeant, escort me to my courtroom." We walked down the corridor where the floor always smells like lemon cleaner and old wood, our footsteps echoing like a clock that forgot how to tick gently. And inside courtroom 8C, I told him to take the cuffs off. He hesitated and Marco didn't, and when the blood came back to my hands, it stung like pins waking up a foot. And I stepped behind the bench. I know as well as I know my own kitchen table, picked up the black walnut gavel with the little plate underneath it that reads Kandahar 2006. A gift that reminds me justice can be quiet and still hit like a hammer. And I asked Doyle if he believed in justice, and he said he believed in control. And I nodded like a man who recognizes a scent he used to wear and set the gavel down and said, "Seal the doors. No one leaves until the truth is on record." The gallery shifted. Reporters lifted their chins. Public defenders started tapping their phones like woodpeckers. Judge Rubin poked his head in with a look that said he'd rather be anywhere else, and Doyle, desperate to stuff toothpaste back into the tube, reached for Ruiz's body cam, but the little cloud icon had already flashed upload complete, and somewhere in that chat a bar hit 100% and a dozen hearts sank. I opened my tablet, pressed play, and the room filled with Doyle's voice. "Easy, cocky board. 50 keys clean. 1.2. Captain gets 10. Judge won't care." And he barked that it was edited fake. Some deep fake trash, and I told him the FBI doesn't edit truth, and they don't deliver fakes to a grand jury. And ADA Paige Lynn, hair pinned back, eyes sharp, slid into the well and whispered, "Project Clean Harbor. That's a federal tag," and I said yes. Title III wiretaps, 10 months of texts and money trails and overtime sheets that don't exist, and impound footage, and the kind of receipts even the devil can't explain away. I signed the initial order and recused from oversight. Retained consultant clearance under Chief Judge Soto, and Doyle tried to laugh, but it came out like a cough that doesn't belong to a healthy man. The screens behind me woke up. 8 feeds like 8 eyes you can't lie to. Squad car, alley, warehouse, evidence door, backroom bar, impound lot, shift, log overlay a text that read, "Move through lot C." And we all watched him hand a duffel with department tags to a man named Ortega, who works 2 steps down from the real boss. And then we watched him slice confiscated powder like it was cake at a wedding. Nobody should be celebrating. And then we watched him toggle his body cam off mid-arrest, and he shouted entrapment, like a kid shouts, "I was just kidding," after a rock breaks a window. And I told him, innocence is step 1, if you want that word to work. And a public defender in the second row bit his lip so he wouldn't smile. I asked if he wanted the worst of it gently or all at once, and he said, "Give me your best shot, Judge." And I said the boy's name was Mateo Cruz, 17, unarmed. You wrote, he lunged. You wrote, he reached for a waistband. You wrote, he matched a suspect. And the backup stream shows a kid with his hands open crying under a busted streetlight. And when the clip played, we kept it clean because pain doesn't need ratings to bruise a soul. And the room took a breath at the same time. You could feel lungs agree for once. And someone near the aisle said, "Oh God," so softly you'd miss it if you weren't listening for truth. "Turn it off," Doyle said, and I told him no. Turn it up. And outside in Harbor Square, word spread the way. Heat spreads in July fast and without permission, and people who had no plan to march found themselves moving. And our city's bronze, called Liberty in Chains, had a new gathering at its base, and the chant wasn't angry. At first it was relieved, like finally somebody said out loud what the neighborhood has been saying at dinner for years. I told the clerk to note for the record that all devices stay on no private corners today, and the feed went everywhere. Barber chairs, taxi dashboards, precinct break rooms, college dorm couches, the nurse's station on 6 where my friend Deb hits play for patients who need a reason to believe something works. And Paige stepped closer to the mic and asked if the federal case was active, and I said it is, and it ends today, and she nodded the way you nod at a bridge you're about to cross, even if it shakes a little. I told Doyle to rise, and he didn't want to, but he did because everyone did, and I read the badge number and the charges: narcotics, conspiracy, obstruction, civil rights violations, assault on a federal officer, tampering with evidence, and told Kelly and Ruiz to stand to surrender badges and guns to the marshals. And they looked at each other like boys caught with spray paint on their fingers, and Marco relieved them of shiny metal they hadn't earned in years. And Doyle said, "My union will bury you." And I glanced at the rep in the corner who sat so still he became furniture, and that stillness was a sermon nobody wanted to preach. I opened a sealed envelope because sometimes theater matters when you're building a road for truth to drive on, and read that the Department of Justice authorizes immediate suspension of Task Force Bravo 12 asset seizure transfer of custody under 18 U.S.C. and RICO, signed Layla Hassan, U.S. Attorney co-signed Chief Judge Soto, and Doyle shouted, "You can't take my pension," and I told him he took it himself, one envelope at a time, when he called stolen money paperwork, and the Harbor Justice Fund will use it for the people he turned into invoices. Victim compensation scholarships with a door and a future on the other side. And people started to clap, and I raised a hand because this isn't celebration, it's repair. And he sagged a little and said, "Please don't punish my family." And I told him the court won't touch them, but his name will, and that's a truth his son will carry or remake. Judge Rubin cleared his throat and said federal review and stepped out, which was fine. Authority isn't clutching every rope, it's stopping the wrong hands from cutting them. And I recessed 20 minutes so the marshals could do their work while a city texted its cousins to turn on the live stream. And I walked into chambers and opened the drawer with the robe that smells like pressed cotton and a certain kind of calm. And I pinned the small purple heart over my chest and thought of my wife telling me years ago, justice doesn't need to raise its voice. It needs to stand where noise can't reach. And my hands shook for 3 seconds, and then they didn't. And Marco said, "Files are live, all green." And I said, "We're not running, we're walking through the front door like we paid rent on this place, because we did." Back on the bench, I tapped the gavel once, a warning shot that never misses, and said, "All present remain seated, all devices. Keep recording. If you came to hide, you came to the wrong room." And the union lawyer tried to recite a script about due process. And I said, "Counselor, your client sold cocaine out of evidence and called it Tuesday. You're lucky I let you keep your seat. Choose gratitude." And he sat, because truth has its own gravity, and the screens rolled more footage. Irish bar with overtime toasts, impound camera, catching a quiet transfer under a lens they thought was asleep, a wire of a voice saying, "We own this city." And I looked at Doyle and said, "No, you rented it with blood money, and the lease ended this morning." And he broke, not loud. He just lost the posture that keeps a lie upright, and the marshals stepped in. And I read the remand said 45 years is the ceiling and sentencing isn't mine today, because humility is part of keeping a city alive. But the record is mine, and it shows a unit that traded a badge for a racket, and a kid who laughed at a dog chasing its tail being turned into a statistic. And we took Doyle through the side door where officers become defendants, and the crowd outside roared like a stadium pretending it's church. And I heard both pain and relief, and I let them coexist, because that's how grown people tell the truth. He turned back once and said, "You just made enemies judge," and I said, "Enemies don't scare me, cowards do." And I stopped renting them space in my head a long time ago. And yeah, that happened. It should have been the end. But justice is tidy on paper, and a hurricane in real life. And a few hours later, Marco came into chambers with a face no man wants to carry, and told me something I won't narrate for clicks. A young person who never asked for any of this, a moment that tore a family at the hinge of its name. And I sat very still, and put the gavel back in its cradle, and understood again that every decision lands on people who didn't get a vote. And that night, the square outside Liberty Hall sounded like celebration, but at my desk it sounded like prayer. And I said a quiet one for a kid I never met, and for Mateo's mother who still keeps a pair of sneakers under her bed, because grief is a room you rearrange, not a door you close. 6 months later, Harbor City didn't look the same. Project Clean Harbor closed with 39 convictions, 2 deputy chiefs, a logistics captain who thought warehouse cameras didn't look up. The blue wall chat dissolved into guilty pleas, and a lot of statements that couldn't keep a straight face. Civilian auditors and transparency boards became the price of wearing a badge, not a punishment, but a standard. And the Harbor Justice Fund wrote its first checks, including a scholarship in Mateo's name that sent 3 teenagers to orientation with a new kind of nervous smile. And people wanted interviews, and I said no. People wanted me to take a bow, and I went back to reading motions at 2 a.m. Because the work doesn't care about applause, and my son Isaiah started hosting youth forums called Straight Talk and told me one afternoon, "Dad, you showed people you can stand still when they want your knees to shake," and I told him my knees shook the whole time, I just didn't move, you know what I mean? Then the whisper that had been bouncing around coffee lids and church basements turned into a billboard. Run. And I said no for a month, and then I stood in front of the courthouse where the slap happened and put my hand on the bronze at the base of Liberty and Chains. And Marco said, "You changed everything, sir." And I said no, the truth did. I just stopped running from it, and I filed a letter that said one line I meant with all the oxygen I had. The bench taught me to speak law. This city taught me to speak humanity. And that night I told a crowd I took a slap and didn't hit back because justice doesn't swing, it builds. And cameras caught it, and the crowd carried it home, and for a moment the floor of this town held steady, the way you hope it will when your kid asks